past, I've made some realizations about this. So, who is the guy speaking? I am Sándor Mesterházy, also known as Kildar, and well, I've been a role player for most of my life. I've been running and playing various long-form boffer fantasy, science fiction, and post-apocalyptic LARPs for like 19 years now, I think. This distinction will be important later, and I also run a YouTube channel in Hungarian, which is not relevant for the most of you. So, and also, other thing to note is my membership in Consensus LARP Studio, which is a LARP organizing umbrella organization here in Hungary. Okay, so what this will be about? What is this social contract we'll be talking of? I won't even try to give an exact definition of it. I will try to give examples of what it can be, and then I will let you think up your own definition, extrapolating from that, because one thing I learned from 19 years of LARPing is that if you give an exact definition of anything, people will come up with things which are outside of your definition, so I won't even try. So, what is social contract? It can be the sum of those base assumptions we make when entering play. It is more than just the rules and design of a game, because it has an even more fundamental layer. Expectations from organizers towards players, expectations of players towards organizers, or even other players, local customs and habits, unspoken rules everyone but you seems to know, because, well, we've always done this way, or, well, just that common sense, and maybe some who is who's in the community. I think it historically was, and it also is right now, an often overlooked topic in our local gaming communities here in Hungary, and I think it is important to be more mindful about it. Not just hand-wave things away, but yeah, common sense is not so common, and sayings like, oh yeah, players are stupid sometimes. I think these sayings can usually be led back to differing cultures of play. The plural here is important because one of my hypotheses for this speech is that I do not think that there is a singular LARPing community in Hungary. We have several different communities which evolved in a parallel way, all coming from friend groups in different roots, be it in the World of Darkness fandom, historical reenactment, airsoft, children's summer camps, fan clubs of Tolkien, or even that one Hungarian-developed tabletop role-playing game in the 90s when the Satanic Panic just started to quiet down and they come up with this book with a big green pentagram on its cover. So there are a lot of different fandoms where LARPing has emerged from in Hungary. So these parallel communities sometimes participate in each other's games, sometimes not. Sometimes they're merged to continue together. Sometimes they split for various reasons. I think this nature of our scene makes for a great example of how different underlying assumptions and unspoken rules can shape the experience of play. I will be trying to present this to you through various examples and stories from my own experience, where these clashing unspoken rules led to various bad or just plain weird experiences. I will not be mentioning any names, neither of people nor LARPs, because this is not about pointing fingers and shaming them, but about the experience, the story itself. Okay, so let's move on to the stories. I've split them into different categories. The first one I call the other laundry detergent. I'm quite sure you have seen TV commercials where they promote some kind of branded laundry detergent and always compare it to some undefined other laundry detergent and how much better it is than that. So here is also a thing with my experience in LARPing. There are these moments when you are reading the pre-game documentation of a LARP or listening to an organizer promoting their event where you feel like, well, this sentence has a lot to unpack and I'm not sure I want to know more. Especially when it is written in a low-key, salty way, snickering at some undefined other LARP. One experience I had in this group is when preparing for a LARP while reading the rulebook. I noticed a passage which said, unlike on other LARPs, There is no system for looting here. You need to actually search the other person to loot them. And I was like, what other LARPs? This is the exact same rule as the other 3 games I've been on that year. Are they salty about some other LARP they've been on? Were there different looting rules on their previous event and they don't know of any other? I will probably never know because they got weirdly defensive when I asked them about it. Another was when I was listening to an organizer promoting their LARP. They went like, unlike on other LARPs, if you want to climb a tree here, you don't need to call a game master to tell people that you are up on the tree. You can just climb it. Again, I was thinking, what other LARPs? Where do they do that? Furthermore, why would I want to climb a tree here? Is it a thing they do here? I let it slide because asking these questions out loud would have been quite disruptive, and I did not think much of it afterwards to ask them in private. But in hindsight, I'm not sure I even should have. When it comes to promoting your LARP, it's also important to set expectations, and this leads to a different kind of group which has the catchphrase of you should have known that we meant it the other way. This is actually not my experience, but a friend told this story to me a few days ago, but it's an old story of theirs. There was a LARP which had in its rules that combat is decided by dice rolls, and after rolling, you can act it out. Fortunately, they did not forget to ask about the details of, okay, how exactly does this work? How do we do the acting out of the combat? What are the boundaries for that and whatever? And the organizers responded, what do you mean by acting out the combat? We don't do that around here. Obviously, we meant that you act out the results, not the combat itself. Don't go swinging around LARP swords. Similar situation of reading different things into the same sentence was that, well, reading different things into the same sentence or just getting your info from a big game of narrative telephone is in the late 2000s, early 2010s, it was the rise of the historical fencing in Hungary. And writing that, some LARPs, mine included, brought it in their rules that, okay, we should make our fights like semi-realistic, advice for a kind of realistic-looking combat. So we wrote things into our rules like, make it look like an actual cut you are making, let it have a clear arc and trajectory instead of just tapping. The intent behind it, as understood by those who wrote it and those who used it regularly, was that you still don't apply serious force behind it, you just make it look like there is. So this really swole bodybuilder-looking dude shows up, and complaints start pouring in that he hits like a brick and never takes any hits. When confronted with these complaints, he said, but I thought that the rule here was that only strong hits count. And of course, compared to him, none of us hit strong enough for him to register. Speaking of hitting strong, one of my favorite pet peeves is contact calibration. How hard the game hits you. Not just in combat, but the physicality of the roleplay. How intense, how far you can go with like touching other players or doing things like this. Most LARP rules have a clause in their combat safety rules about pulling your blows to a reasonable extent and not striking with full force. Or even things like physical role-playing is permitted as long as you don't cause any pain. Interesting side note is that I just heard about a guy who was at LARPs a few years ago, and he actually doesn't feel any pain. So he's like, oh yeah, no, it's no pain, it's okay. And well, the core communities around each of these LARPs eventually do tend to converge to the same level of contact out of habit. But that set level of contact, like, yes, this is a normal person's level of contact, will be different for each of those communities if they don't interact often. My favorite example for that is there are those times when a group which is used to a higher contact level, either because of background in historical reenactment or just going with the notion of, yeah, we're so hardcore, we go full contact. So they go to a LARP which is used to a lesser level of contact. The local players usually don't receive this very well. They are often overwhelmed by them. So the guest group goes home with the notion of, yeah, we totally curb stomped those nerds, or, well, we just fight too well for these people, or something to that extent, but with way more homophobic slurs. So home group is left fuming that those people are bullies, we should ban them forever, and here go years of hating on each other. A prime example I can give is from the mid-2000s, when a team of about 20 historical reenactors showed up at a LARP with, I think it was 70 or 80 participants in total. So they showed up at a LARP as orcs. All of them was dressed in full steel Uruk-hai armor, and they looked amazing, even with today's standards. And back in the 2000s, when a basic tunic put you in the top tier of costuming, it was mind-blowing. Until when they brought out their weapons, which were basically tiny leather-covered, I was hoping foam things on top of completely unpadded long wooden shafts, and started swinging them very efficiently. And, well, some of them got way too much in roll. Like, there was a moment when one of them threw an actual pig lung at their opponent, because they have brought some real butcher byproducts as props. Oh yeah, we are orcs, we are swinging around these pig intestines and whatever. I think from your reaction that I don't need to explain why this could be problematic. One could say that for the weapons, they should have been safety checked, but probably the weapon marshal was not the guy probably the weapon marshal did not want to be the guy who turned like 25% of the players away from the game, who also happened to look the best. So they were hand-waved with, oh yeah, they are trained with it, they can use it. And oh boy, they could use it. Alternatively, there is also the situation where the opposite of that can also happen. A group or a player who is used to a lesser level of contact goes to a LARP which is used to a higher level of contact. And there, they also get overwhelmed, go with some violated boundaries, go home with some bruises maybe, and some overall frustration that they are getting bullied and they probably won't return. The home group usually shrugs it off as, well, if you can't handle the heat, get out of the kitchen. Of course, like I said, it's not just about combat, but the physicality of roleplay as well. Back in the mid...
I was just wondering, when it's about something so physical, aren't there workshops?
I will get into this. I will get into this. 2 more passages and then I will talk about the workshops. So of course, like I said, it's not just about combat. Back in the mid-2000s, there was a large LARP where there was this big group of people who managed to ambush 2 people from an enemy faction. They were like, yeah, we could kill these guys, but this LARP has rules for respawning and they will just respawn. So how about we just tie them up and leave them in the bushes beside our camp? Like for real. For them, this was a perfectly normal thing to do, but for everyone else, they did not even think of it, that this can happen, so they, of course, did not explicitly think of forbidding it beforehand. Of course, different people prefer different contact levels, different games are for different people. I'm not advising against preferences of less or more physicality, or even the preferences of being tied up. I'm not to shame anyone for that, but I'm advising more towards understanding and respecting different cultures of play and recognizing that different games expect different things of you. As a final note on this part, thank you for noticing it, contact level and physicality of roleplay can be calibrated through various workshopping and player safety mechanics which govern the intensity of play. I'm sure most of you know about those. We did not know about those in the 2000s. And also, in my experience, the Hungarian LARPing scene still needs to actually implement those in most of the games, because I have seen them for the last like 5 or 6 years, seen them pop up in various rule books that, yeah, these are totally things you can use and whatnot, but also with the addition of, yeah, these are things you can use, but we never needed to use them ever. So we actually, I think, need to move towards more of implementing them in practice for real. So we have talked about hurt people, let's talk about hurt feelings. How can feelings that hurt on a LARP the best, most efficient way? Of course, where people just start screwing with you on purpose when you expect the game to be not about that. Some games tend to declare a stance on that, how, what exactly the central conflict of the game is, who will be in conflict. Will it be player characters versus others, or player characters needing to band together, or something between those ends? But the reality of that very often falls into the realm of you should know to read between the lines as well. I have a very enlightening tabletop role-playing story about this. I will get back to LARPing in a minute, but I think I had this talk a few months ago, and it was very enlightening on this topic, how we expect different things from the same game. So, do you know the tabletop role-playing game Vampire the Masquerade? And do you know that it got a new edition a few years ago? Sure. Okay. So this 5th edition of Vampire the Masquerade has a character creation mechanic called Relationship Map, which has player characters and various major NPCs on it. And it is public to all participants, and you write your relations between the nodes, like is the relation of two player characters, or what is the relation to a major NPC, and whatever. It's public to all participants. I think it's a great tool of preparing a dynamic character relationship network before the game itself. Until a friend of mine who has only played previous editions of Vampire asked me the big question. But hey, doesn't this lead to metagaming? Because this way I don't have to find out the weaknesses of other player characters in-game when I want to backstab them. While the question itself is kind of missing the point of this mechanic, I think the fact that it had to be asked was illuminating on a topic of how our expectations were different of the same game. For him, secrecy-based PvP backstabbing, where you also need to outwit your fellow players, not just their characters, as well, was an integral core part of the Vampire experience. And that was an expectation which V5 was explicitly never designed to fulfill, as during the character creation process, you also design the common cause you are working towards. I think this can relate to LARPing really well, because superficially, these look like they're the same game, maybe different editions. Like, both of them have this title, Vampire, on the top. You play the same things. Similar things can go also to LARPs. Like, two boffer fantasy LARP, weekend-long LARPs, can look superficially similar. Like, both of them has people dressing up in medieval stuff, both of them has people swinging foam swords around. So one could think that going with the same expectations to both of those, well, I've been to fantasy LARPs before, how this one could be different, it's the same thing. Oh boy, you are wrong. So, getting back to LARP stories, this is one I'm not so proud of, because, well, our group was kind of the bad guy in this. So, in the early 2010s, I was in a group which often portrayed rowdy, confrontative mercenaries in medieval times. We were working for the highest bidder, defended ourselves whenever necessary, and of course, we attempted to never give our lives for any cause. It was fun to play and led us to a lot of fun interactions and fun battles, but it also led to some really bad mutual experiences on LARPs, where the unspoken expectation was that players should band together and go through the breadcrumbs to solve a current mystery and avert some crisis together. Well, you see, on LARPs, which are inherently player versus player based, with player characters confronting and battling other player characters, this kind of team can participate in a wide variety of interesting interactions. On LARPs, which do not feature such conflicts, well, this kind of team makes these conflicts, making them the bullies, asking questions like, why should we do what the crazy wizard said? Who is he to us? Or, why should we do this ritual we found on a piece of paper discarded on the ground? How can you be certain it does what it says and it's not harmful? So this can be destructive to the overall environment, where the expectation is that you should find your own motivation to be on the quest. The reverse of this situation can also happen when A game of backstabbing meets players with these quest-solving type expectations. These also tend to happen, leading to frustration and accusations of everyone here is a murder hobo being thrown from one side, and deflections of, well, we're just being realistic. Did you expect some hippie bullshit from the other? Of course, this is easily solvable by communicating these expectations as clearly as possible, but bear in mind that in Hungarian buffer fantasy LARPs, steering what kind of characters and groups the organizers expect on the game is a fairly new concept. It was practically non-existent or just ignored 10 years ago. And even today, just let's assume that you communicate everything perfectly clearly. You communicate your vision, you communicate what you expect, and then your communication meets the unstoppable force of habit. Just a few months ago, I had this experience. We have been running a big, also buffer fantasy LARP a few months ago. It had a really involved, complicated way of using magic in character with a multi-step process of you having to make incantations, rules governing what could be in your hand while casting, and various verbal signals to tell other players how to react, which were not the same as the names of the spells, and also not the same as the incantations themselves. So this was written down in the game rules, but we also had 15-minute workshops on most game mechanics. This also included. I myself was running this workshop. I explained the process itself, I broke it down into 3 steps of what to do, and in the end, everyone could try it out by showing how their character casts spells. So, after 10 minutes of me explaining things, we turned to, okay, now let's try it out. You think of a spell you know how to cast, because I see that you'll be a wizard type, I'm sure you know a spell, and cast it on the person standing right to you, now. As soon as I started, I said, now, the guy just shouted in the name of the spell, and that's it. 0 out of 3, basically, on the scoring. Afterwards, I asked him in private about, okay, what was that? And he was like, oh, sorry, on the LARPs I go to, it's usually enough to say just the name of the spell. And, well, if you have a habit made during through years of enforcing this, yeah, I guess it can be hard to just switch it on the fly, even after people telling it to you to do it differently, even if you are put on the spot. So, other way, the clearest communication can go wrong is if people do not trust what you have written down. There are really fun ways to make people not trust what you have written down. Let's go to pro tips of how to make players not to trust you as an organizer. So, these really cool techniques, I think the most effective way is, I think it can be best summarized with a comment I have read about, 10 years ago. Back then, the popular notion was that if you announce that your game will be horror-themed, people will not get scared so genuinely because they won't take it seriously because they know it's a horror game and their surprise at the supernatural won't be so authentic to their characters. Well, putting aside concerns of safety, player buy-in, and the cries of, I did not sign up for this, so putting these all aside, there were a lot of LARP scenarios back then which were announced with the instruction that the LARP will be about regular, mundane people without any supernatural elements. After a while, one of those got a comment from a prospective player saying, you see, this instruction makes me certain that it will be either Call of Cthulhu or World of Darkness. And to everyone's surprise, it was Call of Cthulhu. So I think this kind of, the organizer is winking out at you when saying one thing, is the best worst example of an unwritten rule. As here, the worst thing you can do for your own experience is to believe what they have actually said. So, I won't be long now. I only have some final words and closing remarks. Why did I tell you all of this, apart from trying to be some kind of discount stand-up comedian about Hungarian LARPing? The reason I told you all of this is that we are in a really similar space right now as any Hungarian LARPer is when they go to a game of a different group. I would like to implore you all to be mindful of these differences of base assumptions you might have brought to this table. In such a space with dozens of different cultures of play interacting, and by cultures of play in this context I mean people sharing the same or similar social contract, what might be obvious to you is completely unheard of to the other. You might have solutions that worked for you in your environment, and you might be wondering why the person you are explaining it to is so resistant to getting it. And you might also be wondering why that other person seems to try so hard to convince you that that one impossible thing they just proposed, you know that's impossible, and they try so hard to convince you that it's, well, it's so easy, anyone can do it, why don't you do it? Think of the phrase, on every LARP there is, or every LARP is. And you can't finish this sentence with a correct statement to make it non-snarky and smartass and out of the box and to be actually correct in that statement. This, I think, goes for cultures of play as well. I think there are practically no reasonable statements which can be made of all player cultures everywhere. And with these thoughts, I conclude my speech. Thank you all for your attention, and I wish you a great time in Budapest on behalf of my association, Consensus LARP Studio, and I will also be hoping to meet you tonight at the archery practice and the underground party. I have the keys for that venue, so probably I will be the one to guide you there. And thank you again. And I think we are quite ahead of time, so we can just talk about these things, experiences you have had with such meeting different groups. I would prefer funny stories to enraging ones, but of course if you have some fun, enraging story, that also goes. And I think I will put down the mic now.
News to share, but if you have stories to share, this is a good time for it.
I mean, maybe a story, maybe not like an actual story, because it goes on. It could go on for like a few minutes, but let's just say that yes, we have also, we are co-designing a Swedish LARP, and we have definitely had these problems of having players internationally coming there and assuming different things than we assume there, and also I'm from Slovenia, not from Sweden, so you know, as soon as the team became international of design, we already really quickly saw that yes, we need to have a lot of different disclaimers on the unwritten